Hi, in this video, we're going to talk about tree traversal. So we have written both the dunder string method and the find method, and both of these visit every node or every data or element in the tree. Now, there is a small difference between them because find will stop if the data is found, whereas dunder string would always visit every element in the tree. But regardless, these two functions or methods, if you remember them, they look very similar. Now, in fact, many use cases of a tree does involve visiting and performing some sort of functions on each element of the tree. So, for example, we may print out each one of them, or we might say apply some sort of math function like multiply all of them by 10 or something on each element, or um, add all of the elements up, etc. And visiting and performing some sort of operation on every element in a tree, well, exactly once, is what's called a tree traversal. Now, we've seen traversal before in linked list. And in linked list, what we did there was that we have some sort of current pointer pointing to a particular node in the linked list, and then we loop through, and as long as that current node is pointing to a valid node, we do some arbitrary operation on that node. In this example, it just prints it out, but we're not limited to printing it out, right? We can do other things. Now, so when we want to do something or anything to all the elements in the linked list, we basically use this part. It's the same. So this is what's called a boilerplate code. We repeat this same code, but the arbitrary operation can then be, some other different code, depending on what we want to do with the data or the node. Now, for the tree, we can do something similar, but we're going to do something a little different this time, actually. So now, for the tree, the traversal logic is a little more complicated, right? It's no longer just a linear structure like a linked list. Now, but okay, it's more complicated, but we can abstract the traversal logic away in a method. Now, what this method should allow, though, same as in the case of a linked list traversal, is that it should allow some sort of arbitrary operation on each of the elements. Now, the arbitrary operation can be represented by a function. So that means that the traverse method is going to be a higher order function. So we're going to create such a method. We're just going to call it traverse. And it takes a function as a parameter. So that function is the function that will apply on each element in the tree. So here, traverse is going to take a function as a parameter. And just as with the dunder string and the find method, traverse, in order to visit every element in the tree, it will call a recursive version of itself. We're going to call it traverse recurse, and we are going to start at the root of the tree. Now, before I write the recursive version of traverse, if you'd like some practice of writing higher order recursive function, please pause the video and do it yourself first. But I'm going to do it now. So as with all recursive function, we try to take care of the base case first. And the base case is that if the node is none, so that means the tree or subtree is empty, well, there's nothing to do, so we're going to return. Otherwise, we are going to apply the function to the node's data. And after we do that, we're going to recurse to the node's first child, the same function, and we'll do the same thing to the node's sibling. Now that we've written this, let's test it out. And we are simply going to call traverse with the print function, and hopefully we print out everything in the tree, and indeed we did. And one thing I want to point out is this type of traversal is called pre-order traversal because it visits the data first before it visits other parts of the tree. Now, there are other types of traversal. Some is called in order, and then there's the post order. So a data structure class will discuss these in more details. Now we're able to print out all the elements in a tree, but there is no indentation, so we don't see the structure of the tree. Now, how do we add the indentation back? Well, remember that the indentation is proportional to the depth. So what then we can do is to add the depth as an additional parameter so that the function can know about the depth. So we'll start at the root. We know the depth is 0, which means the recursive traverse has to take an additional depth um, parameter, and that depth should be passed to the user supply function. Now, remember how the depth changes? Well, going to the child, the depth it increases by 1, but going to the sibling, the depth does not change. So we're going to just have to say depth is what it was. Now, how does the user supply function take advantage of the additional information on depth? Well, print wouldn't have a clue what to do with depth, so we have to now write a lambda function that the parameters would be the data and the depth. What we'll do is then the print will print some indentation before we print the data. So let's say we have 2 blanks, and we'll multiply the blanks by depth, and then we'll print out the string representation of the data. All right, so let's hope that works. And yes, it does. Great. Hopefully that was fun, but we don't have to stop there. We can do something even more intricate, such as adding up all the numbers in the whole tree. So how can we do that? So let's think about what kind of information the user supply function would need in order to sum up everything. Well, first of all, it needs the sum that has been calculated so far, right? As it visits each node, it would in the process adding up everything. So we'll have a place to accumulate the sum so far, right? And then the next thing is then that function would add the node that it is currently visiting to the sum that has been calculated so far. And then finally, it will return the new sum. So that means we'll have to just pass in additional information to the function and then pass that information along as the data or the result is returned. So what that means in practice is, let's start with the user supply function. So the lambda now, in addition to the data and the depth, it would also take a new parameter, let's call it sum so far. And what it's going to do is it's going to add the data with the sum so far. And that's the return value from visiting one element in the tree. Now, the modification we'll have to make to the recursive or the function application in the recursive traverse is that now we're going to have to give it a sum so far, and that's the new parameter, and we'll also return or store the result that the lambda expression or the user supply function returns. Now, obviously, it's not going to be happy. It's like, what is sum so far? Where is it going to come from? Well, there's really no information here inside this function itself that tells us what the sum so far is. So let's add it as a parameter, sum so far, which means this the caller of the recursive version of the traverse also have to tell us what the sum so far is. Now, in this case, it also doesn't know where that comes from. So let's make that another parameter, sum so far. Now, the next thing we should fix is the recursive call itself, because now it takes a parameter sum so far, so we have to pass that on as an argument to the recursive call. So that's that. Now we're not done yet, because if we look at the base case, if the subtree is now empty, but we have a sum that we have calculated so far, so instead of returning nothing, we really should return the sum that has been calculated so far, so that the calculation can or the summation process can keep carrying on. Now, because we return a sum so far in the recursive traverse now, so that means this call is going to return a sum so far, and we should remember that. Then this gets passed on to the next recursive call, and it will also return a result, and we should also remember that. And finally, once we're done with all our recursive call, we should return the sum so far, so that to be consistent. More importantly, this is so that the result that has been accumulated so far will get always passed to the user supply function, so that it can use it for whatever it has to use it for. And finally, let's go back to where traverse is called to sum up all of our numbers. Remember, not only we take a function as a parameter now, we also have to take an initial value. So what is the initial value for the sum so far? Well, we haven't done anything yet, so the sum will be 0. So, and we should print it out. And this will no longer work because it needs an actual parameter now. So let's comment that out and let's run it. And yes, there we go. So here is the sum of all the numbers from adding 0 through 9. So that is 45. Now, one more thing we should do back in the traverse function. Now, even though we have called this parameter sum so far, but we call it sum so far only because we're trying to accumulate or add up all the numbers in the tree. Now, this function itself, though, it's generic. It doesn't necessarily have to add everything up, right? So it can do other things. And if you look at the definition here, or the code here, it doesn't assume that this is a sum. This is an integer. So we really should not name it sum so far. We should name it something a little more generic, such as, let's say, result. Right? And we'll also rename this result. And so that's it. This is a generic version of traverse that allows an arbitrary user client supply function to perform whatever it wants on the data in each node of the tree, and get some sort of result. What result it gets is entirely up to the user supply function. The traverse method just ensures that that piece of information is passed around properly and returned properly at the end. So with two examples of how to use the traverse function or method to solve some problems, I'm going to ask you to use it to solve even more problems. So the first one is, can you print all the numbers in a tree but multiply each of them by 2? The next one is, can you try to return a list of all the elements in the tree? And then finally, can you rewrite the dunder method using the traverse method? So please pause the video and give these problems a try. And here are the answers. So the first one, now remember the user supply function, they all have to take 3 parameters, right? The data itself, the depth, and the results. And so to just print out all the elements multiplied by 2, well, it just print out the data multiplied by 2. The initial or the result, well, it's really not using the result at all, so we can just pass it something arbitrary like none. Now, to return a list of all the elements, then we basically can assume the result is always a list that we have accumulated of all the elements that has been visited so far, and then we can concatenate that list with a new list that just contains the data, and we'll start with an empty list. Now, finally, to rewrite dunder string, again, we assume that the result is always a string that contains all the nodes that have been visited so far and has been put into the string result, and we'll keep that result around, put a new line at the end of it, and basically just add the indentation. So we'll use 2 spaces multiplied by the depth, right? The indentation is proportional to the depth, and then we'll put the data at the end of that indentation. So that's it, and we start the result. The starting result will be an empty string, right? We haven't visited any nodes yet. I hope you can now see the usefulness of the traverse method, because we have replaced the fairly long and recursive dunder string with just a traverse and a one-line lambda function. So as we just saw, the traverse method can do a number of useful things. So for example, it can put all the elements in a tree into another data structure, such as a list, or return some sort of accumulated results of all the elements, such as a string that represent all of them, or the sum of all of them. So if you think about it a little more carefully, the traverse method is really kind of like map and reduce row into one, and it applies to a tree, obviously. So now we know it's useful, but as useful as it is really just one of a number of ways to allow some sort of arbitrary manipulation or processing of the elements of a tree. Another way is to actually turn the tree into an iterable, and then all of its elements can be iterated over in a for loop. And this is actually a way that I personally really like even better than traverse, but it is a topic for a different class, a class on data structure in Python. But I do want to mention it as to encourage you to continue study data structure and Python.